In 1944, German fighter pilots had a secret weapon that had nothing to do with bullets or bombs. It was a simple maneuver that could save their lives every single time. When an American P-51 Mustang locked onto their tail, they would flip their aircraft upside down and dive straight toward the earth at maximum speed. They did this with absolute confidence because they knew something their enemy didn't. The American flight manuals explicitly forbade U.S. pilots from following them down. The warnings were printed in red letters. Disobey and you would die. But on one freezing morning over occupied France, a 19-year-old kid from the mountains of West Virginia decided those rules didn't apply to him. What happened next would change aerial combat forever and prove that sometimes the only way to win is to do exactly what everyone says is impossible. The year was 1944, and the skies over Europe had become the most dangerous place on Earth. Every day, thousands of young men climbed into metal machines and flew into combat, knowing that many of them would never return. The odds were brutal. The attrition rate for bomber crews was catastrophic. Fighter pilots had slightly better chances, but not by much. In this environment of constant death, the United States Army Air Forces had one technological advantage that was supposed to tip the scales in their favor: the North American P-51 Mustang. This aircraft was a masterpiece of engineering. Sleek, fast, and equipped with the legendary Rolls-Royce Merlin engine built under license by Packard in America. The Mustang could fly higher, faster, and farther than almost anything the Germans had. It was designed to escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back, something no other Allied fighter could do. But despite this incredible machine, there was one situation where American pilots were still helpless: the vertical dive. German pilots, especially the veterans who had survived years of combat, knew this weakness and they exploited it ruthlessly. Their aircraft, particularly the Messerschmitt Bf 109, had one critical advantage: a direct fuel injection system. This technology meant that no matter what angle the aircraft flew at, even completely inverted or in a straight vertical dive, the engine would continue running at full power. American aircraft, including the Mustang, used carburetor-based fuel systems. When these planes were pushed into extreme negative G maneuvers like a sudden dive, the fuel would slosh away from the intake. The engine would sputter, cough, and sometimes cut out entirely. For precious seconds, the pilot would lose power at the exact moment he needed it most. German pilots understood this limitation better than the Americans did themselves. So whenever a Luftwaffe pilot found himself in trouble, outnumbered or outgunned, he had a reliable escape plan: roll inverted, push the stick forward, dive for the deck. The American behind him would either have to break off the pursuit or try to follow and risk his engine quitting. Either way, the German pilot would live to fight another day. But the fuel system wasn't the only reason American pilots were ordered not to follow. There was something far more terrifying waiting for anyone who dared push their Mustang into a high-speed vertical dive: compressibility. This was a phenomenon that even the smartest aeronautical engineers of the time barely understood. The theory was this: as an aircraft approaches the speed of sound, the air flowing over the wings and control surfaces begins to behave in unpredictable and violent ways. Shock waves form. The smooth airflow that allows a pilot to control his aircraft breaks down into turbulent chaos. The controls become heavy, unresponsive, or worse, they reverse their effects. Pull back on the stick and the nose might drop instead of rise. The aircraft could enter an uncontrollable tumble. The wings could literally rip off from the stress. Pilots who experienced compressibility and survived described it as the most terrifying sensation imaginable. The aircraft would shake violently. Strange noises would fill the cockpit. And no matter what they did with the controls, nothing responded the way it was supposed to. It felt like the plane was trying to tear itself apart. The engineers at MIT and Wright Field had run calculations and wind tunnel tests. Their conclusion was clear: the P-51 Mustang was not designed to fly near the speed of sound. In a steep vertical dive with full throttle, the aircraft could easily approach speeds where compressibility effects would begin. The official flight manuals were updated with explicit warnings: do not pursue enemy aircraft in vertical dives exceeding certain speeds. Do not attempt to follow German fighters using negative G dive escapes. These orders were not suggestions. They were backed by science, by engineering data, and by the full authority of the United States Army Air Forces. Violating them was considered reckless insubordination. More than one pilot had been grounded or court-martialed for taking unnecessary risks. The message was clear: follow the rules or face the consequences. But rules are written by people who sit in offices. Combat is fought by people who sit in cockpits. And sometimes those two groups see the world very differently. Chuck Yeager was not your typical fighter pilot. Most of the men flying P-51s over Europe came from middle-class families. Many had attended college, some had engineering degrees. They understood the technical manuals because they had been trained to think in terms of systems and specifications. Yeager was different. He grew up in the small town of Hamlin, West Virginia, in a part of Appalachia where poverty was normal and education beyond high school was rare. His father worked in the gas fields. The family hunted for food. Yeager learned to shoot a rifle before he learned algebra. He could track a squirrel through dense forest and hit it between the eyes from 100 yards away. This skill, which seemed irrelevant to modern warfare, would turn out to be more valuable than any engineering degree. Because Yeager had something most pilots lacked: superhuman vision. His eyesight tested at 20/10, meaning he could see at 20 feet what a normal person could see at 10. In air combat, where spotting the enemy first often meant the difference between life and death, this was an extraordinary advantage. Yeager enlisted in the Army Air Forces in 1941, just before Pearl Harbor. He didn't start as a pilot. He was assigned as an aircraft mechanic. He learned how engines worked by taking them apart and putting them back together. He understood the Mustang not as a collection of aerodynamic theories, but as a physical machine with strengths and weaknesses. When he was eventually selected for pilot training, he approached flying the same way he approached hunting, with instinct, observation, and a willingness to push boundaries. He didn't just memorize the flight manual. He tested what the aircraft could actually do. He flew it hard. He learned its sounds, its vibrations, its personality. By the time he arrived in England as part of the 357th Fighter Group in early 1944, Yeager was still a kid, barely 19 years old, baby-faced and skinny. Other pilots looked at him and saw a farm boy who probably wouldn't last a month. They had no idea they were looking at someone who would redefine what was possible in a fighter plane. Yeager's first few combat missions were routine escort duty: fly with the bombers, watch for German fighters, engage if necessary. He got his first kill in March 1944, shooting down a Bf-109 over France. It was a clean victory. Textbook. But it didn't prepare him for what was coming. Just days later, on his 8th mission, Yeager's luck ran out in the worst possible way. His Mustang was hit by German anti-aircraft fire over occupied France. The aircraft was too damaged to make it back to England. Yeager had no choice. He bailed out over enemy territory. For most pilots, this was the end of the war. If you were lucky, you became a prisoner. If you were unlucky, you were executed by German soldiers or French collaborators. Yeager was lucky. He was found by members of the French resistance. They hid him, treated his injuries, and began the dangerous process of smuggling him out of France through the Pyrenees Mountains into neutral Spain. The journey nearly killed him. Yeager and another downed airman were guided by resistance fighters across some of the most treacherous terrain in Europe in the middle of winter. At one point, Yeager helped carry a wounded Allied airman on a makeshift stretcher for miles through mountain passes. He later said it was the hardest thing he ever did, but he made it. After weeks of hiding and walking, he reached Spain, was turned over to Allied authorities, and eventually made it back to England. Under normal circumstances, that would have been the end of Yeager's combat career. U.S. military policy was clear. Any pilot who had been shot down over occupied territory and aided by the resistance could not fly combat missions again. The reason was simple. If they were shot down a second time and captured, the Germans could torture them for information about the resistance networks. The people who had saved them would be exposed and killed. Yeager understood the logic, but he also thought it was bureaucratic nonsense. He went directly to the top. He requested a meeting with General Dwight D. Eisenhower himself, the supreme commander of Allied forces in Europe. Eisenhower listened to Yeager's argument. The young pilot pointed out that D-Day was approaching. Every experienced fighter pilot would be needed. He promised that if he was shot down again, he would not allow himself to be captured alive. Eisenhower, impressed by the kid's determination and perhaps recognizing that desperate times called for flexible rules, granted him a special exemption. Yeager was cleared to fly combat again. He returned to the 357th Fighter Group a different person. He had walked through enemy territory. He had seen the brutality of the occupation up close. He had helped carry a dying man across mountains. The scared teenager was gone. In his place was someone who understood that survival sometimes required breaking rules that other people considered sacred. This mindset would serve him well in the weeks ahead. It was October 1944. The Allied invasion of Europe was well underway, but the fighting was far from over. The Luftwaffe, though badly outnumbered and running low on fuel and experienced pilots, was still dangerous. German fighters would strike at Allied bomber formations whenever they could, trying to inflict maximum damage before being overwhelmed. Yeager was flying his P-51 Mustang, which he had named Glamorous Glenn, after his girlfriend Glennis back home, on a bomber escort mission deep into Germany. The bomber stream stretched for miles, hundreds of B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators droning through the cold sky at 20,000 feet, surrounded by a protective screen of P-51s and P-47 Thunderbolts. Everything seemed routine. The bombers were approaching their target. Flak was bursting in black puffs all around them. And then the call came over the radio. Bandits. High. 6 o'clock. German fighters were diving out of the sun. It was a classic Luftwaffe tactic. Climb above the bomber formation using superior altitude performance, then dive at high speed through the Allied fighter screen, make a single firing pass at the bombers, and blow through before the American fighters could react. It was hit-and-run warfare. High risk but potentially high reward. Yeager's head snapped around. His exceptional vision picked out the enemy fighters before most of his squadron mates even saw them. Bf-109s, at least 6 of them, streaking down like hawks. Yeager broke formation and turned hard to intercept. Other Mustangs followed. The sky erupted into chaos. Fighters twisted and turned. Tracer rounds streaked through the air. Radio discipline collapsed into shouted warnings and curses. Yeager latched onto one of the Bf-109s. The German pilot saw him coming and tried to shake him with a hard turn. Yeager stayed glued to his tail. The Mustang's superior turning ability at high altitude gave him the advantage. The German pilot realized he was in trouble, and that's when he did exactly what he had been trained to do. He rolled inverted and pushed into a vertical dive. Yeager saw the enemy aircraft flip upside down and point its nose straight at the earth 4 miles below. This was the moment of decision. Every instinct, every rule, every warning in the flight manual told him to break off. Do not follow. Do not risk compressibility. Do not throw away your life chasing one enemy fighter. Let him go. But Yeager wasn't thinking about the manual. He was thinking about the bomber crews behind him. If he let this German pilot escape, the man would climb back up, regroup, and attack another formation another day. More American bombers would burn. More crews would die. Yeager made his choice in a fraction of a second. He rolled his Mustang inverted and shoved the stick forward. The nose dropped. The engine roared, and he entered the forbidden dive. The first few seconds were exhilarating. The Mustang accelerated like nothing Yeager had ever felt before. The altimeter unwound in a blur. 20,000 feet, 18,000, 15,000. The airspeed indicator climbed past 300 miles per hour. 320, 340. The wind screamed over the canopy. The earth rushed up at terrifying speed. Yeager kept the throttle wide open and the nose pointed down. The German Bf-109 was still ahead of him, also diving at full power. But the Mustang's engine was more powerful. The American plane was faster. Slowly, painfully slowly, Yeager began to close the distance. 360 miles per hour, 380. The airframe began to shake. 400 miles per hour. The vibrations grew worse. Yeager's hands tightened on the control stick. And then it happened. Compressibility. The stick went heavy. Unnaturally heavy. It felt like it was bolted in place. Yeager pulled back experimentally. Nothing. The Mustang ignored him and kept diving. The nose wanted to tuck under even more. The shaking intensified. The entire aircraft rattled like it was going to come apart. Strange buffeting sounds filled the cockpit. This was exactly what the engineers had warned about. The airflow over the wings had gone supersonic in some places, subsonic in others. Shock waves were forming and collapsing. The elevators, the control surfaces that normally allowed the pilot to pitch the nose up or down, were stuck in turbulent air. They had lost almost all effectiveness. Most pilots, feeling this for the first time, would have panicked. They would have pulled harder on the stick, trying to force the nose up. When that didn't work, they would have pulled even harder, using both hands and all their strength, and they would have died. Because at these speeds, if you managed to force the nose up suddenly, the G-forces would rip the wings off or cause the pilot to black out. Either way, it was over. But Yeager didn't panic. Remember, this was a kid who had spent his childhood hunting in the mountains. He knew that when an animal didn't respond to force, you adjusted your approach. He also knew his aircraft. He had spent hundreds of hours as a mechanic. He understood that machines had limits, but also that they often had more tolerance than the engineers believed. So instead of hauling back on the stick with all his strength, Yeager did something counterintuitive. He trimmed. The P-51 had a trim wheel on the left side of the cockpit. It was a mechanical system that adjusted the angle of a small tab on the elevator. Pilots used it to fine-tune the aircraft's pitch so they didn't have to hold constant pressure on the stick during long flights. In normal conditions, trim was a convenience. In compressibility, it became a lifeline. Yeager reached down with his left hand and cranked the trim wheel back. The small tab on the elevator shifted. It caught the airflow differently, and slowly, the nose began to rise. It wasn't a dramatic pullout. It was gradual, almost gentle, but it was enough. The Mustang began to level off. As the nose came up and the speed decreased slightly, the compressibility effects began to fade. The buffeting smoothed out. The controls started responding again. Yeager was below 10,000 feet now. The ground was close, terrifyingly close, but he had control again. He looked ahead through the gun sight. The German Bf-109 was right there, still diving. The German pilot must have assumed the American had broken off. Why wouldn't he? No American pilot had ever followed this far, but Yeager was still there, and now he had a clean shot. He squeezed the trigger. 650 caliber machine guns roared to life. Tracer rounds arced across the sky. The bullets walked up the spine of the enemy fighter and into the cockpit. Smoke erupted. The Bf-109 rolled violently to the left and kept going, tumbling out of control until it smashed into the French countryside in a ball of fire. Yeager pulled out of the dive at less than 5,000 feet, breathing hard, his hands shaking slightly from adrenaline. He had just done the impossible. When Yeager returned to base and climbed out of his cockpit, his crew chief looked at the aircraft with wide eyes. The Mustang had taken a beating. Rivets had popped from the stress. The metal skin was wrinkled in places from the extreme forces, but the plane was intact. It had survived. Yeager filed his after-action report, describing what had happened in clinical detail. He had pursued an enemy aircraft into a high-speed dive exceeding 400 miles per hour. He had experienced severe compressibility effects. He had used the trim system to regain control. He had destroyed the enemy. When his squadron commander read the report, there was a long silence. Technically, Yeager had violated direct orders. The flight manual said not to do what he had just done, but he had also proven that it could be done, and he had shot down a German fighter in the process. More importantly, he had discovered a technique that other pilots could use: the trim system. That was the key. If you encountered compressibility, don't fight the stick. Use the trim. Word spread quickly through the fighter groups stationed in England. Yeager's technique was discussed in briefings. Other pilots began to experiment, carefully at first, then with growing confidence. The German dive escape, which had been a guaranteed survival tactic for years, suddenly became a death trap. Luftwaffe pilots would roll inverted and dive as usual, expecting safety, only to find American Mustangs following them all the way down. The psychological impact was devastating. The Germans lost one of their most reliable defensive maneuvers. Allied fighter pilots gained a significant tactical advantage, and it all came from one 19-year-old kid who didn't know enough to be afraid of the engineering calculations. But Yeager wasn't done. Over the following months, he racked up kill after kill. His score climbed steadily. He flew aggressively, always pushing the Mustang to its limits. On one remarkable day in October 1944, he shot down 5 German aircraft in a single mission, earning the title of Ace in a Day, one of the rarest achievements in air combat. By the end of the war, Yeager had been credited with 11.5 aerial victories, the half credit coming from a shared kill. But his legend wasn't built on the number of kills. It was built on his willingness to do what everyone else said was impossible. After the war ended in 1945, Yeager stayed in the newly formed United States Air Force. His reputation as a pilot who could fly anything and push boundaries made him a natural choice for the next great challenge in aviation, breaking the sound barrier. In 1947, just 3 years after that forbidden dive over France, Yeager climbed into an experimental rocket plane called the X-1. The same scientists who had warned about compressibility were now telling everyone that flying faster than sound might be impossible. They theorized that an aircraft would hit an invisible wall of air. The controls would stop working. The plane would disintegrate. It was, they said, a suicide mission. Yeager had heard that before. On October 14, 1947, he flew the X-1 to Mach 106, becoming the first human being to officially break the sound barrier in level flight. Once again, the farm kid from West Virginia had proven the experts wrong. The story of that 1944 dive over France is more than just an exciting moment in World War II history. It's a case study in the difference between theoretical knowledge and practical experience. The engineers who wrote the flight manuals were not wrong about compressibility. It was real. It was dangerous. Pilots who mishandled it did die. But the engineers made a critical error. They assumed that because the phenomenon was dangerous, it was unsurvivable. They drew a line and said, "Do not cross this." Yeager crossed the line and found that on the other side, there was a solution. The trim system was already built into the aircraft. The capability to handle compressibility was there all along. It just took someone with the courage and the instinct to discover it. This is a pattern that repeats throughout history. Experts define limits. Outsiders ignore those limits. And occasionally, the outsiders discover that the limits were not where everyone thought they were. There's another lesson here about the nature of rules in life or death situations. Rules exist for good reasons. They protect people from unnecessary risk. They encode the hard-won lessons of past failures. But rules are also general. They apply to the average person in the average situation. Combat is never average. In war, the calculus changes. The cost of following the rules might be higher than the cost of breaking them. Yeager understood this instinctively. He wasn't reckless. He didn't dive after that German fighter because he wanted to be a hero. He did it because in that specific moment, it was the tactically correct decision. If he let the enemy escape, the threat would persist. If he pursued and failed, at worst, he would die alone. If he pursued and succeeded, he would remove a threat and potentially learn something valuable. The risk-reward calculation made sense. This kind of situational judgment cannot be taught in a classroom. It comes from experience, instinct, and a clear understanding of what actually matters. It's worth noting that Yeager's success was not purely about individual courage. It was also about the machine he was flying. The P-51 Mustang was an extraordinarily well-built aircraft. When Yeager pushed it beyond its supposed limits, it held together. The wings didn't snap off. The airframe didn't collapse. The engineers who designed the Mustang had built-in safety margins that they themselves didn't fully appreciate. This is a credit to their skill. Even when they underestimated what the aircraft could do, they had designed it robustly enough to survive. The Mustang's structural integrity combined with Yeager's piloting skill made the impossible possible. It's a reminder that great achievements often require both excellent tools and skilled operators. Neither alone is sufficient. Yeager in a poorly designed aircraft would have died. A lesser pilot in a Mustang would not have thought to use the trim system. The impact of Yeager's actions rippled far beyond that single combat mission. By proving that compressibility could be managed, he opened the door to high-speed flight research. After the war, the data from pilots like Yeager who had flown at transonic speeds in combat was carefully studied. It informed the design of the next generation of jet fighters. It helped engineers understand how to shape wings and control surfaces to minimize compressibility effects. The lessons learned in combat dives over Europe directly contributed to the development of supersonic aircraft. Yeager's X-1 flight in 1947 was the culmination of this knowledge, and it all started with a teenager who ignored a warning printed in red letters. This is how progress often happens. Not through careful incremental steps, but through leaps taken by people who refuse to accept that something cannot be done. There's a fascinating psychological dimension to this story as well. Why was Yeager able to do what other pilots could not? Part of it was his background. He didn't have the academic training that would have taught him to defer to expert authority. He had grown up solving problems with his hands, not with equations. When the flight manual said the dive was suicidal, Jaeger didn't have years of engineering education telling him the manual must be right. He had practical experience telling him that machines often perform differently than their specifications suggest. This cognitive independence, this willingness to trust his own judgment over official doctrine, was a double-edged sword. In most cases, it would have gotten him killed. In this case, it saved his life and changed history. The lesson is not that we should ignore expert advice. The lesson is that expertise has limits, and sometimes those limits can only be discovered by people willing to test them. Another factor was Jaeger's emotional control under stress. When the compressibility effects hit and the aircraft started shaking violently, he didn't freeze. He didn't panic. He thought through the problem logically, even while plummeting toward the Earth at over 400 miles per hour. This kind of composure is rare. It can't be taught through classroom instruction. It comes from experience in high-pressure situations and perhaps from innate psychological traits. Jaeger's hunting background may have helped. When you're tracking dangerous game in the wilderness, panic gets you killed. You learn to stay calm, assess the situation, and make decisions based on reality rather than fear. That mindset translated directly to the cockpit. When the normal controls didn't work, Jaeger didn't waste time being afraid. He immediately looked for an alternative, the trim wheel. It was a simple tool, right there within reach, that he had used hundreds of times before. But in that moment of crisis, he was the first person to think of using it to solve a compressibility problem. The German pilot in that Bf-109 probably never knew what happened. From his perspective, he had executed a standard escape maneuver. Roll inverted, dive, wait for the American to give up. He had done it before and it had always worked. He had no reason to believe this time would be different. By the time he realized the Mustang was still behind him, it was too late. The bullets were already hitting his aircraft. This is the nature of tactical innovation in war. It only works until the enemy adapts. After Jaeger's technique became common knowledge among Allied pilots, German fighters could no longer rely on the dive escape. They had to find new tactics. The war became even more difficult for the Luftwaffe. This is another lesson. Advantages in combat are temporary. What works today may not work tomorrow. Continuous adaptation is essential for survival. Looking back from the perspective of 80 years later, it's easy to see Jaeger's dive as an inevitable step in the evolution of aviation, but it didn't feel inevitable to the people living through it. To them, it was a shocking violation of established safety protocols. Some of Jaeger's superiors were angry that he had taken such a risk. Others recognized that he had discovered something important. The Air Force eventually updated the P-51 flight manual to include information about using trim to recover from compressibility. What had been forbidden became standard procedure. This is how institutions evolve. A rule is established based on the best available knowledge. Someone breaks the rule and survives. The institution studies what happened. If the rule breaking led to a better outcome, the rule is changed. The process is slow and often resisted by those who have invested their authority in the old rules. But over time, evidence wins. Jaeger went on to have an extraordinary career. He became a test pilot, flying dozens of experimental aircraft. He was the first commandant of the Air Force's Aerospace Research Pilot School, training the astronauts who would eventually go to the moon. He flew combat missions again in Vietnam. He retired as a brigadier general in 1975. He lived to the age of 97, passing away in December 2020. Throughout his life, he remained modest about his achievements. He often said that he was just a mechanic who learned to fly and got lucky. But luck is what you call skill and preparation when they meet opportunity. Jaeger had the skill. He had spent years preparing by learning everything he could about the machines he flew. And when the opportunity came, in the form of a German fighter diving toward the Earth, he was ready to seize it. The title of this story asks a question. How can doing what the manual calls suicide be the only way to win? The answer is that victory often requires calculated risk. The manual represents average wisdom. It's designed to keep the average pilot alive in average situations. But war doesn't provide average situations. It provides chaos, unpredictability, and moments where the safe choice guarantees failure. In those moments, the people who win are the ones who can accurately assess risk, understand their tools better than the people who designed them, and execute under pressure. Jaeger possessed all three qualities. He looked at the forbidden dive and understood that while it was dangerous, It was not as dangerous as letting a skilled enemy pilot escape to kill another day. He knew his Mustang's capabilities because he had worked on the engines himself, and when the moment came, he flew with precision and control. That combination turned a suicide mission into a victory. This story also illustrates the importance of questioning authority, not in a reckless or arrogant way, but with a clear-eyed assessment of when the rules apply and when they don't. The engineers who wrote the flight manual were smart, educated people. They had good reasons for their warnings, but they had never been in combat at 19 years old with a German fighter in their gun sights in seconds to make a decision. Context matters. Jaeger respected the manual's warnings enough to understand the danger, but he didn't treat them as absolute laws of physics. He treated them as guidelines that could be tested. That nuanced approach, respecting expertise while maintaining independent judgment, is a hallmark of great decision-makers in any field. For anyone listening to this story, whether you're interested in aviation, military history, or just in understanding what makes people capable of extraordinary things, Chuck Yeager's Forbidden Dive offers multiple lessons. First, expertise has limits. The smartest people in the room can be wrong, especially when they're making predictions about untested situations. Second, tools often have more capability than their designers realize. The P-51 could survive compressibility because it was built with safety margins. Modern systems are the same. There's often hidden capacity waiting to be discovered. Third, success in high-stakes situations requires emotional control. Panic is the enemy. Clear thinking, even when everything is shaking and screaming, is what separates those who survive from those who don't. Fourth, calculated risk is different from recklessness. Jaeger didn't dive after that German fighter on a whim. He made a split-second judgment based on experience and situational awareness. That's not luck. That's skill. The Forbidden Dive over France in 1944 is a snapshot of a moment when one person's decision changed the course of aerial warfare. But it's also a story about human potential, about what becomes possible when skill, courage, and opportunity align, about the importance of questioning assumptions and testing limits, about the difference between following rules and understanding principles. Chuck Yeager was not a perfect person. He could be difficult to work with. He had a competitive streak that sometimes rubbed people the wrong way. But in that moment, 4 miles above occupied France, with his aircraft shaking apart and the ground rushing up at terrifying speed, he was exactly the right person in the right place. He did what the manual said was impossible, and in doing so, he proved that sometimes the only way to win is to ignore everyone who tells you that you can't. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of aviation history's most daring moments, make sure to subscribe to the channel, hit that like button, and drop a comment below. Let me know what other incredible stories from World War II you'd like to hear about. There are thousands of untold moments of courage, innovation, and sheer determination that changed the world. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.